Good evening and welcome to Novara Live. My name's Stephen Methven, and tonight I'm joined by economist extraordinaire, Grace Blakeley. Grace, welcome to the show.
Hey, it's great to be here.
Coming up tonight, Ukraine has agreed to the terms of a ceasefire, but will Russia play ball? Emily Thornberry takes on Israel's deputy foreign minister, and US President Donald Trump picks up a second job, shilling for Tesla. Stay tuned for all of that and more. But before we get started, a reminder that tickets are available for our next Downstream IRL. I'll be speaking, not me, Aaron will be speaking with historian and political scientist Ilan Pappe. That's at Earth Hackney on the 7th of April. You can buy tickets via the link in the description. Donald Trump has declared an international trade war. Today, 25% tariffs on US imports of steel and aluminium came into effect, and they apply to all countries with no exemptions and no exceptions. Now, most world leaders have reacted with fury.
We firmly believe that in a world fraught with geoeconomic and political uncertainties, it is not in our common interest to burden our economies with such tariffs.
Such a decision by the Trump administration is entirely unjustified. This is against the spirit of our two nations' enduring friendship and fundamentally at odds with the benefits that our economic partnership has delivered over more than 70 years.
And if we go into a recession, it's self-made by one person. It's called President Trump's recession, which shouldn't be this way. We should be booming, both countries right now.
That was the European Commission Chief Ursula von der Leyen, Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, and Premier of Canada's most populous province, Ontario, Doug Ford. Now, Trump initially planned to impose a 50% tariff on steel and aluminium imports from Canada, singling the country out for extra punishment. In a Truth Social post, he explained why. He says, based on Ontario, Canada placing a 25% tariff on electricity coming into the United States, I've instructed my Secretary of Commerce to add an additional 25% tariff, making it 50%, on all steel and aluminium coming into the United States from Canada, one of the highest tariffing nations anywhere in the world. This will go into effect tomorrow morning, March 12. Now, that's a reference to Ontario's Premier Doug Ford threatening to impose a 25% tariff on electricity supplied by Canada to a number of northeastern US states. Ford backed down on those plans, and Trump went back to the 25% tariff he's imposed on everyone else. But this afternoon, Canada hit back.
Today, I am announcing that the Government of Canada, following a dollar-for-dollar approach, will be imposing, as of 12:01 a.m. tomorrow, March 13th, 2025, 25% reciprocal tariffs on an additional $29.8 billion of imports from the United States.
The EU has responded aggressively to Trump's tariffs too. It's put together a 26 billion euro package of tariffs on imports from the US into the bloc, with goods like bourbon, jeans, and Harley-Davidson motorbikes amongst the products affected. Now, there's good reason for Canada and the EU to respond so dramatically to Trump's import restrictions. They both provide a huge amount of steel to the US, with Canada the biggest exporter to the country and the EU in third place. But the tariffs have also hit the UK, and although we sell a much smaller amount of steel and aluminium to the US, it's still our second biggest export market. That doesn't mean that Trump's tariffs won't have an economic impact here, though. Steel that's no longer going to the US from other countries will likely create a glut, pushing down prices and making it even harder for the UK steel industry to compete. That risk has led to calls from the unions for the UK to protect British steel. Unite's General Secretary Sharon Graham said this: "Our government must act decisively to protect the steel industry and its workers following the announcement of US tariffs. This is a matter of national security. Steel should be immediately designated as critical national infrastructure to properly protect it. Given the importance of steel to our economy and our everyday lives, it's vital it is designated as critical national infrastructure, and rules are introduced to ensure that the public sector always buys UK-produced steel." So far, the UK's response to Trump's tariffs has been much more muted than other countries. This was Prime Minister Keir Starmer at Prime Minister's Questions today.
On the question of tariffs, obviously, like everybody else, I'm disappointed to see global tariffs in relation to steel and aluminium. But we will take a pragmatic approach. We are, as he knows, negotiating an economic deal which covers and will include tariffs if we succeed. But we will keep all options on the table.
So while Starmer says every option is on the table, including presumably counter tariffs, it sounds like his preference is to negotiate a UK exemption. But one EU official didn't think that was a strategy that was likely to work, telling The Guardian this. It's not very productive to now start negotiating about removing the tariff. That's a bit of a stinking fish theory, where you put a stinking fish on the table and then you start negotiating to remove that stinking fish. And then you say, wow, we have a great result. There's no stinking fish on the table. That's not a very productive conversation. Not sure I quite get it. Well, I think I do. Some have found Starmer's response to the tariffs a little limp. This was Good Morning Britain's Susanna Reid tackling Treasury Minister James Murray.
Cool the heads. EU's hit back with retaliation. Canada's hit back with retaliation. We're just going to say, oh, we're terribly disappointed about all this and we'll just carry on chatting to you. It just doesn't sound like we're standing up for ourselves. And we knew this was in the pipeline. You have an industry that's worth 400 million in terms of our exports to the United States, and a whole load of steel workers this morning at Port Talbot in Wales wondering if their jobs are going to get lost.
Well, in terms of supporting steel workers, we are absolutely committed to supporting the industry. We're supporting UK steel industry's application to the Trade Remedies Authority to ask them to look at whether further measures might be necessary to protect UK producers. But I'm also really clear that we're in a different position than other countries. We're in a different position than the EU, for instance. We're in a position where we have this rapid dialogue about securing an economic agreement that came out of the back of the Prime Minister's visit to Washington, D.C.
last month.
Just briefly, and that's the right way to support British businesses.
So we're not retaliating. Our language is staying at disappointed rather than furious, angry, upset. How soon do you think you can get this 25% tax on steel and going from the UK to US lifted?
I'm not going to speculate about when the economic agreement might come to fruition. But
do you have any confidence at all you'll get it
We are negotiating
sorted
rapidly to make sure that that happens.
Grace, I'm always extremely happy to see you on the show, but I'm particularly happy today because you're an economist and I'm going to ask you to walk us through all of this. Could you start by telling us, how tariffs work, who pays them in the end, and what the economic impacts are likely to be?
Sure. Well, there's not one answer to that question, really. It really depends what the tariffs are applied on, how they're applied, and in what context. And the problem with what Trump has tried to do, I can see what he's trying to do, and I'll explain what he's trying to do. But it is coming at a very fragile point for the global economy and actually for the American economy as well. And there is a very good chance that these tariffs are going to backfire, basically. So Trump has obviously imposed these tariffs on steel imports. Now, that is primarily going to affect Canada and Mexico, who are the US's largest trading partners in steel. It just basically means that the cost of steel is going to rise for American consumers. Now, why would you do this? The idea is that if you make foreign imports more expensive, you can help to stimulate domestic production of a commodity like steel, for example. So that's really part of what is motivating Trump here. And I would say that there are two main motivations, one of which is to move away from multilateralism, so lots of countries negotiating over trade deals, and towards a more bilateral approach, so the US negotiating one-on-one with its major trading partners. That's a very kind of Trumpian idea, the idea that he's going to be the one that makes lots of deals, and that's how the economy works. And the second thing is a broader issue that he has probably more support with throughout the rest of the Republican Party, and indeed probably some Democrats, which is reducing the US's current account deficit. Now, this is a little bit more complicated, but it's worth getting into. The US runs a current account deficit and a fiscal deficit, and that's quite unusual. It's not something that you're really supposed to be able to do. What that means is the US government kind of spends more than it earns, basically, in terms of tax revenues, whilst also importing more than it exports. And what that means is that there's lots and lots of dollars flowing around the global economy. You need US dollars to be able to buy US exports. The trade deficit that the US runs means there's lots of extra dollars circulating in the global economy. Those two things for the US go hand in hand. Why? Because the dollar is the world's reserve currency. There need to be extra dollars in the global economy so that central banks can keep them in the bank. And these central banks, from the ECB to the Bank of England, they have dollars because dollars are the kind of currency of last resort. Whenever a bank in the UK, say, gets into trouble, they need dollars to be able to, deal with their debts, basically. It's also good to have dollars on hand when trade in, for example, oil is denominated in dollars, or if you want to buy any good that you have to use dollars for. It's also good for clearing transactions between lots of different currencies. So everyone needs dollars, basically. And the US rides to the rescue and provides those dollars by running these two dual deficits. Now, Trump wants to get rid of the current account deficit. So he wants to kind of create a more balanced trade situation for the US. The issue for him is that he can't end the current account deficit without compromising the US's role as the world's reserve currency. Those extra dollars need to be getting pumped out into the global economy so that there is enough, basically, for everyone else to use. And if this plan to kind of reduce the US's current account deficit by imposing tariffs and making imports more expensive were to work, then countries would start moving away from using the US dollar. It would cease to be such an integral part of the world's financial system, and they would start moving towards using other currencies. There are lots of Europeans who think this is a really big opportunity for the euro to step in and become that reserve currency. And it gives you this exorbitant privilege to be able to run this current account deficit and to be able to run a fiscal deficit at the same time, which, a lot of people say is a privilege, but Trump seems to think is a problem. Now, there are reasons that he thinks it's a problem. He wants to kind of empower US manufacturing. He wants to deal with the fact that he has this, what he considers to be a big kind of, basically a new Cold War with China. He wants to make sure that US manufacturers are able to compete with Chinese manufacturers. He wants to be able to give meat to his base of jobs, American jobs that are going to be created in the heartland if US manufacturing does come back. But there is no way that he's going to be able to do that without the dollar losing its status as the world's reserve currency. There are some people in his administration who think they can manage this tension, but it doesn't look good for them. So what's actually going to happen? Well, it's very unlikely that these tariffs are actually going to reduce the US's current account deficit. Why? A lot of reasons. First and foremost, manufacturing in the US relies on inputs from abroad that are going to be subject to these tariffs. So it might actually make things worse by making it more difficult for US producers to access the inputs they need and actually compromising their ability to produce. It may also encourage other countries to start, producing their own, to move away from US imports and stimulate their productive economies. And it might also encourage new blocks to emerge, new trading blocks to emerge that exclude the US and create a more dynamic economy with the US much more at the periphery. These are all potentially long-term implications of these moves. In the short term, it's just going to push up inflation, and it's also creating a lot of fear in financial markets. Basically, it pushes up inflation because you are increasing the cost of inputs, and until you can build that domestic manufacturing base that produces those same commodities that you're tariffing, that's going to push up prices, and it's creating fear This isn't like a necessary thing that had to happen, but it's to do with the point that we're at in the financial and economic cycle. Lots of people have been talking about the fact that there's going to be a stock market crash, and we can get into why that is at some other point. But investors were already a bit spooked. They were already thinking, we don't really know what's going to happen in 2025. Then Trump comes in, introduces these tariffs, which potentially increase inflation, whilst also, not really having the intended effects that they're supposed to have in terms of increasing demand. And then he's cutting loads of jobs as well, which means, it could end up pushing the economy into recession at the same time. So you've seen this huge sell-off in financial markets, which is, partly people worried about the tariffs and partly them worried about a wider trade war. So, I can see what Trump is trying to do here, right? I don't like these assessments that you often see in the liberal press that he's an idiot, he's irrational, he doesn't understand international trade. Maybe Trump himself doesn't, but he's being advised by people who definitely do have a strategy. I just think the issue is that it's coming at the wrong time in terms of the economic cycle, because it's probably going to push us into first a significant correction in financial markets and then a recession. But it's also coming at the wrong time in world history, because a lot of countries are already moving away from using the dollar as their reserve currency. China has already built up this big, powerful domestic manufacturing base. And even though those tariffs are designed to stop these processes, they could actually end up accelerating them.
That's very interesting, because I had a China expert on the show a little while back, and she was saying that China is positioning the renminbi, their currency, as a candidate reserve currency. So given the USA's geopolitical antagonism towards China, it sounds like from what you're saying, that could in fact accelerate some such process, even though it may be in fact that the euro is preferred in the end, nonetheless destabilizing the dollar in a way that means that for example, China's currency has a better look in. Okay, so the explanation you... Oh, sorry, go on,
I was going to say the only issue there is that China's currency isn't internationalized. So it's not kind of freely floating on international markets. And for a currency to function as a reserve currency, you have to basically loosen centralized control over the value of that currency, basically, which is something that the Chinese have historically not been willing to do. But it is a long-term part of their plan to try and make their currency the world's reserve currency. So who knows? They might see this as an opportunity and push that forward.
Right, exactly. Now, the explanation you gave us there, Grace, is very different from the one that one of Trump's allies gave last night. So I want to play you a clip. It's Caroline Levitt, the White House press secretary, answering a question from an Associated Press journalist yesterday.
When President Trump last addressed the BRT when he was on the campaign trail, his big push was on tax cuts. He's going there today as he's proposing tax hikes in the form of tariffs. And I'm curious why he's prioritizing that over the tax cuts.
He's actually not implementing tax hikes. Tariffs are a tax hike on foreign countries that, again, have been ripping us off. Tariffs are a tax cut for the American people. And the president is a staunch advocate of tax cuts. As you know, he campaigned on no taxes on tips, no taxes on overtime, no taxes on Social Security benefits. He is committed to all three of those things, and he expects Congress to pass them later this year.
I'm sorry, have you ever paid a tariff? Because I have. They don't get charged on foreign companies, they get charged on the importers.
And ultimately, when we have fair and balanced trade, which the American people have not seen in decades, as I said at the beginning, revenues will stay here, wages will go up, and our country will be made wealthy again. And I think it's insulting that you are trying to test my knowledge of economics and the decisions that this president has made. I'm now regret giving a question to the Associated Press.
Grace, give us your reaction
the famously
to that.
Biased Associated Press.
Yeah, they love the Gulf of Mexico. Give us your reaction to that little economic lesson.
Fascinating. Firstly, the first thing I noticed is that she did the comms error 101 of repeating the opponent's frame. Tariffs are not a tax hike. And all people will hear and remember then is tariffs and tax hike, and that's forever going to be associated in their brains. But no, I mean, she basically just repeated in much simpler terms my explanation, the second part of my explanation there, which was to say that the tariffs are designed as a way to kind of revive American manufacturing and restore America's place as a great power. that's able to kind of, I suppose, rely much more on domestic production, allegedly wants to create jobs, although the kind of manufacturing that you would see reshored to the US if these tariffs were to work would not be particularly labor intensive. It would much more likely to be, a few jobs and then a lot of technology. But as I said, there is this fundamental contradiction, which is that if you want the dollar as the world's reserve currency, you have to run a current account deficit. There have to be excess dollars for other countries to use. And even beyond that, the other way to reduce the current account deficit, and this is what tariffs do over the short term, is basically make imports more expensive. They're supposed to make your exports, they're supposed to make foreign exports less competitive, and so your imports. This is the exports of foreign countries into your economy are supposed to become more expensive, right? Which is why they're basically saying this is a tax hike for consumers. And so what that's effectively doing is making consumers in real terms poorer. And this is one way that you could reduce America's current account deficit, is basically just deliver a massive hit to American consumers, saying, you basically need to stop acting, which they currently do, as the world's consumers of last resort, and rebalance the American economy away from consumption and towards production. And what does that mean? Well, it basically means that people's living standards fall and their ability to consume as much as they want, which has been largely the case for the American middle class for quite some time now, is compromised. And people like Trump, for lots of reasons. I'm not saying that they don't. His base adores him, obviously. And partisanship in American politics is so deeply entrenched that, you're not going to see any significant mass drop in support, at least over the short to medium term, for Trump. But it is worth remembering that he won this election on the economy. Biden lost on the economy, and particularly on inflation. Now, if Trump delivers the combination of higher inflation and a stock market crash and potentially a recession, that is going to have a massive impact on support for the Republicans. Now, what I think Trump and his team think they can do is a kind of Margaret Thatcher shock and awe strategy of creating a big recession, almost kind of disempowering workers, disempowering the working class, reasserting the power of capital, and then rebuilding from a stronger base. But Thatcher was only able to do that because she started a war that suddenly increased her popularity and made people forget that 3 million people had been unemployed. And I mean, Trump could do that, but it would kind of be contrary to his largely isolationist rhetoric. So I really don't think, and I might, you might be able to play this back to me in a few years and say you were completely wrong. I don't think the Republicans can survive a combination of high inflation and a recession and a stock market crash. I also don't think it would be sustainable in terms of their backers. So whether or not this actually ends up happening and being maintained is a big question. I just can't see how Trump could follow through on all of the things he's promised in this particular economic environment, which is one of widespread fear and pretty strong consensus of a falling stock market, which reduces the wealth of a lot of people that like Trump, and potentially a recession this year. I don't see how he can just stay the course when that is the context.
Look, we've talked a lot about the US strategy behind this, or and what the impacts of it might be. But let's look at what some other countries and blocs have been doing. So, for example, the EU and Canada have imposed counter tariffs. The UK hasn't done that, at least not yet. And I guess this is both an economic and a political question. Should they? What are the economic impacts of counter tariffs? And also, is it politically a wise thing to do for the UK?
Yeah, I mean, the discussion that we've been having so far, I've explicitly not tried to separate the economic from the political, because I just don't think that you can. I don't think you can do that in any context, but it's especially true when it comes to international trade. I've actually been reading a great book recently by Nat Dyer called Ricardo's Dream. And David Ricardo was one of the economists who came up with the kind of original justification for, globalization and reducing tariffs and promoting international trade, which was the idea of comparative advantage. And he basically says, his famous example is Portugal and England are producing wine and cloth, respectively. And they should both specialize in producing those things and then trade with each other. And that will create gains for everyone in terms of efficiency. And in this book, he actually tells the story of how that trade treaty between Portugal and England came about. And it was all about politics and imperialism and military protection. And it had very little to do with Ricardo's arguments about comparative advantage. And this is a similar situation that I think we're seeing today. America's aims for this tariff war are primarily political, and economics is, as Thatcher would say, the method. The object is to reassert America's power at the global stage. And equally for the UK, the reason that we haven't immediately come back and imposed tariffs is a political consideration, which is that Atlanticism and the relationship with the US has always been the kind of sine qua non of UK foreign policy. It's really something that's quite central to the ideology, I think, of the section of the Labour Party that's currently in charge. They really hate the wing of Labour that kind of opposes American imperialism and kind of advocates for a fairer and more just world order. They really value and want to maintain that relationship with the US, regardless of who is in charge. So, and ultimately, when you look at this, you take a step back and you look at the UK's options here. We are pretty insignificant in terms of this trade war. We aren't part of a major trading bloc. We are at best a kind of, political football that Trump can use to say, oh, look, these guys are on my side, or I got these concessions out of this country, or these people haven't imposed retaliatory tariffs on me. But we're not probably a country that particularly figures in his considerations as to whether or not he is going to continue with this trade war. So Labour really has a choice as to whether or not they want to protect British industry or promote Atlanticism. And I think their instinct will be to, obviously, because they don't really care about workers, is to maintain the relationship with the US. Having said that, just reimposing retaliatory tariffs isn't necessarily going to be enough or a good thing on its own for the UK. If we're going to say, right, we're going to impose tariffs to protect British industry, do other things to protect British industry and to promote innovation and to protect jobs and to, ensure that workers are able to bargain for higher wages, all of these things that Labour has completely failed to do. In other words, for tariffs to work, they really have to be part of an industrial strategy. And that's something that I don't think this Labour government is willing to touch.
Yeah, I think you're right there. And I think you're completely right about them prioritising Atlanticism over industry and workers at home. Let's keep an eye on that. But in the meantime, let's have a look at some market reaction to Trump's trade war. On Tuesday, US stocks fell as investors sold off shares, perhaps fearing further economic instability as those tariffs take hold. One Wall Street expert told CNN this market is just blatantly sick and tired of the back and forth on trade policy. It feels as though the administration continues to move the goalposts. With that much uncertainty, it's impossible for investors to have any confidence. The tariffs appear to be impacting the UK's markets too. The FTSE 100 dropped to its lowest level in 2 months this morning, the latest dip in a string of losses. Grace, I feel like I know how you're going to answer this given what you just said, but the big fear here is that Trump's trade war is going to, as you say, create a massive market correction or indeed create a recession. Is this turmoil that we're seeing in the markets giving us a sense of whether that's going to happen?
I really think we have to look at what's going on in the markets right now as part of something much bigger than just the trade war. Even before Trump, we knew that Trump was going to go ahead with these tariffs, there were a lot of pretty smart investors who were saying some of these stocks, particularly the Magnificent Seven, the big tech stocks, they're worth too much. And so we know how bubbles work, right? Let's take, for example, like the tech bubble in the late 1990s. you get a lot of hype around a particular trend. Then it was like the internet and, internet companies. And investors get really excited about the future of this technology. And they think, well, it doesn't really matter whether or not this company is making profits from this technology now, because one day it's going to completely transform everything. And at that point in the future, these companies will make massive profits. So I want to get in at the ground floor. Tons of money ends up going into a bunch of companies. There is not very much oversight because everyone's so hyped about the potential of this new technology. Sometimes there's cases of fraud. A lot of the time, there's cases of kind of unwise investments that don't end up being profitable. And eventually expectations become so divorced from reality that people start thinking, actually, did we make a bit of a mistake here? Have we gone a bit overboard in our expectations as to the future profits that these companies and this technology is likely to make? And of course, that's what happened with the tech bubble. You saw a big market reaction driven by, a few different things. Some specific companies were shown to be not as well governed as we thought they were. And the market crashed. A few companies went under. Ultimately, it recovered. The same thing is basically happening today with AI. There's been just an astonishing flow of money into the big tech companies, all of which have made massive investments in AI. And of course, NVIDIA, which produces the chips that are required for this AI technology to work. And it's become completely divorced from reality, not least because none of these companies have really shown a viable model for how they plan to profit from this technology in the future. So it was already, we were in a kind of a bit of a speculative bubble. And you could really see this from the way that money in stock markets was concentrated. So the Magnificent Seven made up a huge proportion. I think it was like over a third of the value of the S&P 500. I wrote an article on this on my Substack about, is the AI bubble going to burst? And that was like a month or two ago. So there was just so much money, so much of the value in financial markets in the US was made up by just investments in these companies, that anyone looking at that was like, okay, well, if there's any bad news for any of these companies, which there has been for Tesla, by the way, for lots of reasons, not least because Elon Musk has been just shown to be such an alienating and polarizing character, then that could create this kind of like sudden reversal where everyone starts thinking, oh, okay, actually, these companies are too valuable. They're going to start falling. So I better take my money out now. And then the cycle kind of continues in reverse. So that is really what we're seeing at the moment. But it could have carried on longer had it not been for this kind of, uncertainty in trade policy. It's really the uncertainty that investors don't like. They don't know. They don't feel like they can predict what Trump is going to do. And that makes them anxious. And combined with a bunch of other, stuff that's already been going on in the global economy and low expectations about future growth, people are starting to think, right, okay, well, the bull run is over. There's going to be a correction. I may as well take my money out now. That could happen without really causing a major recession. It could end up just, hurting a few companies, wiping off some value off stock markets, reducing the value of people's savings and pensions, etc. But the fact that Trump is also laying off loads of workers, and that these tariffs are likely to increase inflation, and the general environment of economic uncertainty that's been created by this administration means that we may also get a recession. Maybe this year, maybe next year, but it's looking increasingly likely.
Following talks between senior Ukrainian and US officials in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, Ukraine has announced it's ready to accept a 30-day ceasefire in the war with Russia. Perhaps even more significantly, the US said it will immediately lift restrictions on intelligence sharing and military aid to Ukraine. This is Trump addressing reporters outside the White House following those talks.
But very importantly, and I said it, Ukraine, ceasefire, Ukraine. Ceasefire, just agreed to a little while ago. Now we have to go to Russia and hopefully President Putin will agree to that also, and we can get this show on the road. We can get this horrible war where 2,000-3,000 soldiers a week, every week, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 sometimes. I get the reports, and they're not American soldiers. They're Ukrainian and they're Russian. But people are being killed outside of that. People are being killed in the cities as things explode throughout the cities. And we want to get that war over with. So I think it's a very big, I think it's a big difference between the last visit you saw at the Oval Office?
That reference for the last visit there was Trump referring to the televised bust-up between him and Zelensky that happened earlier this month. Now, so far, Russia hasn't agreed to the ceasefire deal. The Kremlin has said that Putin must be briefed by the US before deciding if the proposal is acceptable. US Secretary of State Marco Rubio spoke to reporters during a brief layover in Ireland.
We'll have contact with them today. There's already been contacts at different levels with counterparts, different members of the administration, and that'll continue. But as far as the Russian reaction to it, that's really the question here. And that is, this is a few hours old. We're going to bring it to them directly. We're going to say that Ukraine is prepared to stop all battlefield activity and begin the immediate process of negotiating an enduring end to the war. And we'll see what their response is. If their response is yes, then we know we've made real progress and there's a real chance of peace. If their response is no, it would be highly unfortunate and it would make their intentions clear. So that's what we're hoping to hear from them. And obviously, as I said, that this was not prearranged for them. So they're probably processing the news the same as the rest of the world. So we hope to have a positive answer from them. The ball is truly in their court.
So Rubio kind of hinting there that if Putin rejects the deal, it's likely to anger Trump and could damage the newly warm relationship between the two states. But Russia is sounding bullish. Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova said, quote, "The shaping of the position of the Russian Federation does not take place abroad due to some agreements or efforts of some other parties." And on Telegram, senior Russian Senator Konstantin Kosachev suggested that, unlike Ukraine, Russia doesn't need to obey the US. This is a translation of that post. The results of the American-Ukrainian talks in Jeddah show only one thing: the tail wags the dog. Scenario performed by Zelensky with Trump, unlike Biden, definitely does not work. The conditions are American, not Ukrainian. The Ukrainians agree to what they are told, and at the same time they bow and fawn. What is the formula alone worth? We will sign any agreement on resources when it's convenient for Washington. Zelensky is on the defensive, or as the State Department representative put it, Trump put Zelensky in his place. Russia is advancing, he means in the war, and therefore it will be different with Russia. Any agreements, with all the understanding of the need for compromise, will be on our terms, not American. And this is not boasting, but an understanding that real agreements are still being written there on the front line, which Washington should also understand. Now, Putin has previously rejected the idea of a temporary ceasefire. Earlier this year, he told Russia's Security Council that there should not be a short truce, which he described as a chance for Ukraine to regroup and rearm, but rather a long-term peace. Putin has also said he'll only end the invasion if a series of maximalist demands are met. So these include Ukraine forgoing NATO membership, the US has already ruled that out, and undergoing partial demilitarization. Putin also wants no foreign peacekeepers serving in the country, and he wants control of the 4 Ukrainian regions Putin claimed in 2022 being fully ceded to Russia. Hailing the US-Ukraine talks as the, quote, first big constructive discussion with the US, Zelensky particularly welcomed the decision to resume US aid intelligence sharing. He said the US would have to act together with European countries to make Russia end the war, and he rejected the demand to cede territory, saying this: "We are not going to recognize any territories occupied by the Russians. This is the most important red line." Zelensky was also asked about reports he might visit the White House again soon. He said he hadn't received an invitation, but that any visit would have to end positively for both parties. Now, despite the rhetoric from representatives of the Russian Federation, it's possible a compromise will happen. Russia is believed to have suffered far more casualties than it officially recognizes. I think it says officially only 6,000. And sanctions have also caused significant hardship for the civilian population. Many ordinary Russians will be keen to see an end to the fighting. However, pro-war hardliners in the Kremlin will likely see an early ceasefire as a betrayal. And while it's unlikely Russian negotiators can reshape the ceasefire deals so that all Putin's demands are met, there might be room for maneuver. Analysts have suggested there might be some acceptance of calls for limitations on Ukrainian long-range weaponry, if not full demilitarization, and Ukrainian withdrawal from Kursk, the small pocket of Russian territory it's captured. Grace, nobody ever really likes to make predictions in politics, but what do you think? Is it possible that Russia will agree to some version of this temporary ceasefire deal, perhaps with their own conditions added?
I think the reason that Putin is behaving in this way is because he knows he's kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, he can't really end the war. This is something that is really the foundation of his popularity at the moment. It's a similar situation as to what Netanyahu is, really stoking up nationalistic sentiment to encourage people to ignore all other issues when it comes to, a lack of freedom and also the complete destruction of the non-war economy. But the war economy is also coming up against real constraints too. Now, what Russia has done is create a really effective war economy machine, basically funded by fossil fuel exports. The war economy itself has been astonishingly effective. So even with sanctions, even with all of the constraints that have been imposed, the kind of, military Keynesianism model of just directing all resources towards the production of munitions, moving troops and goods around, all of the stuff that is required to make the war economy work. That whole infrastructure has come online in a really, really significant way. And it's created jobs. For some people, it's boosted incomes. Then, of course, there are the payments that are being offered to young men to sign up and go and fight in the war. Sometimes, particularly in Russia's poorest regions, this is a lot of money for these people. So there's been a lot of money pumped into the economy. Were it not for the fossil fuel revenues, that would ultimately be unsustainable. It is already even starting to look unsustainable, but it is not currently unsustainable. And actually, a significant portion of the population might even have seen an increase in their living standards as a result of this kind of total mobilization and pursuit of war. What Putin will be looking at, however, is if there is a global recession, which is not outside of the realms of possibility, oil prices will fall. There's already been some previous downward pressure on oil prices. Now, what would OPEC do if oil prices fell? Well, they would restrict production to try and keep prices relatively high, but that would still mean lower revenues. And obviously, Europe is trying to move away from Russian fossil fuels as well, although still relies on them relatively significantly. So that will be looming large in his mind. It's basically, can I continue to fund and finance this war? Because if not, Russia will basically be facing a situation of hyperinflation. If they cannot get access to foreign currency or somehow magically, dramatically increase productivity, then they're going to face a situation of lots of money being pumped into the economy and not really very much to show for it. And that is going to create a problem of inflation over the long run, a larger problem than they already have. And there is already a significant amount of inflation and interest rates are really, really high. So, yeah, that is, I think, basically the difficulty that Putin faces. It's that obviously he doesn't want to look weak. He doesn't want to look like he's backed down because he's stoked this nationalist sentiment and saying we are strong, the classic way that authoritarian rulers do. He's also massively clamped down on dissent in just like, you thought Russia before the war was bad. Today it's horrifying. But there are these real issues when it comes to resources that are not really escapable over the long run unless oil prices stay really high, in which case, and that is a concerning reality, in which case he would be able to continue to fight this war for a very long time, which is another reason why it's so important for all of us to move towards renewables, and actually why this should be part of any military strategy that, for example, the European Union is considering. Moving away from a dependence upon fossil fuels in general, right? Not just imports of Russian natural gas, but actually really fully pushing for decarbonization and, maybe even cooperating with countries like China that have seen such movements forward in terms of their capacity to manufacture the inputs needed for renewables. That would reduce demand for fossil fuels in general and compromise Putin's strategy for funding the war.
Labour MP Emily Thornberry is chair of Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee, and yesterday she used a meeting of that committee to bring up the dodgy dealings of a senior Israeli politician, while Thornberry was on an official visit to Israel.
Would you expect, Minister, if there was a visiting delegation of members of Parliament to the House of Commons, For the delegation to be videoed without their knowledge or consent?
If someone was visiting the House of Commons?
Yes.
Certainly not. I was thinking that'd be very unusual.
Or for it to be put onto Instagram and indeed briefed to, let's say, the Daily Telegraph in disparaging terms?
I'm not familiar with the details, but clearly if someone was visiting the House of Commons, we'd want to show them
And it would be
courtesy.
particularly bad, wouldn't it, if it was the Deputy Foreign Minister of Israel who would be videoed in the UK and for disparaging comments to be made about her evidence or her private meeting that she'd had, let's say, with us. Because the opposite has just happened to us. And a video of us at the Knesset meeting, the Deputy Foreign Minister, has been posted on Instagram. We understand that, certainly we had no knowledge that it was being videoed and assumed, of course, that it would never happen.
Thornberry was talking there to Foreign Office Minister Hamish Falconer. So who is Israel's Deputy Foreign Minister? Sharon Haskell is currently a member of the right-wing New Hope party, though she's done a tour through most of Israel's right-leaning parties in her short career. She's been serving in Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's government since last year. Now, since Thornberry's intervention, Haskell appears to have removed the secretly recorded footage from her Instagram. But everything is forever on the internet. We believe this is what she posted.
What happens if there's elections tomorrow at the West Bank? Did you go there to talk to them? Why hasn't been an election there?
Well, I can give you the answers. The first is obviously that when there was an election and Hamas was elected and there was a rejection of that by the international community. Secondly, when there was a suggested election, there was a disagreement with Israel as to whether or not the people of East Jerusalem could vote.
The fact is that there's no elections because the day after Hamas is going to take control. And if we agree in any way to a two-state solution, or the Palestinian Authority is going to control Gaza, it's going to be at the hands of Hamas again. So the fact is that you're asking me to give Gaza again to Hamas. And that's when people come and tell us, you need to do the two-state solution now. For us, it means, in reality, you give it to Hamas back. And that's something that we cannot accept.
A source in the Knesset told the Jerusalem Post that Thornberry's meeting with Haskell was clearly being recorded and no filming was done without the participants' knowledge. Funny that Haskell deleted it then. As Thornberry mentioned there, the Telegraph also referenced the secret recording in a recent puff piece on Haskell. Headlined, "The BBC has made 80 errors damaging Israel's reputation. That's no mistake." The piece appeared to celebrate Haskell's campaign to get the BBC to pull its documentary, Gaza, How to Survive a War Zone. Some of the Telegraph's descriptions of the Deputy Foreign Minister were beyond fawning, like this one. Ms. Haskell is one of those magnetic individuals who don't raise their voices in order to make a point. Instead, there's an intense relentlessness. She is utterly certain of the Manichaean justice of her case, that history is on her side as she crushes the arguments in front of her. Emily Thornberry, the Labour chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, found this out the hard way last month when she visited Jerusalem to discuss the fabled two-state solution. In a video posted by Ms. Haskell on Instagram, she calmly asked Ms. Thornberry if the Labour MP understood the unhappy history of democratic exercises in the Palestinian territories, if she had spoken to anyone in the West Bank to ask how they would vote. Ms. Haskell believes they would vote for Hamas. In the end, Ms. Thornberry trailed off mid-sentence, meekly waving her hand, perhaps relieved to move the conversation on. At the committee meeting, Thornberry let it be known that she's pretty pissed off.
I've just found out about it. And to say that I'm cross might be an understatement. There were many things said in the Knesset by many members of the Knesset that we found quite provocative and indeed, if I'm really honest, quite insulting. And the attitude of some of the members of the Knesset were remarkably rude. And we did our utmost to keep decorum at all times and to remain polite and restrained. But I do think this takes it to another level.
Before secretly recording a member of the British government, Sharon Haskell was being widely tipped as Israel's next ambassador to the UK. Too bad that doesn't seem very likely now. Although, Grace, I say it doesn't seem very likely that Haskell's going to get this promotion to ambassador to Britain. But, given that our government, including Emily Thornberry, who actually went on live TV to defend Israel's siege of Gaza at the beginning of the genocide, given that they seem to prepared to forgive Israel like absolutely everything, perhaps I'm too optimistic. So I want to ask you, is humiliating Emily Thornberry and using these classic dirty tricks against her going to even remotely damage the UK's friendship with Israel?
Oh, no. I mean, I think that's pretty clear. What was striking about that clip was just how weak and fumbling Thornberry looked in comparison to just I think the Telegraph used the word Manichaean. That's something that's usually used not in positive terms, meaning basically this like rigid, unyielding worldview divided between good and evil that many, particularly Israeli right-wingers, utterly epitomize, basically saying we are, incapable of doing wrong in our battle against this enemy, which is unflinchingly and unremittingly evil. And that was very clearly the argument that she was trying to make. And Thornberry didn't really know how to deal with that. And actually, if you think about how utterly polarized Israeli society has become and how easy it has become to dehumanize and completely strip of any agency or humanity Palestinians in the country, then there will be a lot of Israelis who will be looking at that and celebrating it. And, maybe saying we are a strong nation that is capable of basically pushing around declining power, which is what the UK is, run by a government that doesn't really seem to be knowing what it's doing. And ultimately, they know that we're just going to do whatever the US says anyway. Because again, this government has shown time and time again, as we've already discussed on this show, that its primary foreign policy aim is just to maintain a good relationship with the US, regardless of what we have to give up.
Yeah, and the problem for our government is that as US foreign policy changes, as it's likely to do, they're going to look increasingly stupid because they don't have any policy of their own to fill in the vacuums that arise.
Even the stuff on Russia, for example, Keir Starmer saying, I'm going to cut the aid budget to increase defense, right? And that could be seen as a kind of FU to America because they're saying that they're kind of pulling away. But that's exactly what Trump wants. He literally wants NATO countries to increase spending on defense. He's actually said that. That's what he's like using his position, his power in Ukraine to do. It's to say you have to increase your defense spending to the levels that we have all agreed to as part of NATO. And he did it by doing the exact same thing that Trump had did by cutting the aid budget. So it's kind of getting a bit pathetic. It's like Blair-esque, if not worse, the extent to which it reminds me of that scene in Love Actually when the US president comes over and then Hugh Grant stands up to him and everyone cheers him on because we all know that we're America's lapdog. He's doing that, but the opposite.
Elon Musk's car company Tesla is not having an easy time. Tesla's sales rooms and factories across the US have been hit by vandalism and protests in response to Musk's role in US President Donald Trump's administration. Most have been peaceful, though fires were intentionally set at Tesla showrooms and charging stations in Colorado and Massachusetts last week. And at a Tesla outlet in New York last week, 6 people were arrested at a very large protest against Musk's Department of Government Efficiency. Celebrities have also been, as is their style, ostentatiously returning their Teslas. And all the negative publicity has been hitting the company's bottom line. On Monday, Tesla shares fell by 15%, the steepest drop in 5 years, confirming the company's downwards trajectory. Meanwhile, a survey of Tesla investors found that 85% of them believed Elon Musk's politics were having a negative or extremely negative impact on the company. So it's been a tough few weeks for poor Elon Musk, and it's at times like this that you really need a friend. Step in Musk's BFF, President of the United States, Donald Trump.
Oh, that's beautiful. Wow. That's beautiful. This is a different panel than I've had. Everything's computer. I'm going to buy because, number one, it's a great product, as good as it gets. and number two, because this man has devoted his energy and his life to doing this. And I think he's been treated very unfairly by a very small group of people. And I just want people to know that you can't be penalized for being a patriot. And he's a great patriot.
Nothing to see here. Normal, normal, normal. The most powerful man in the world doing an infomercial for his biggest political donor's car company. And Trump even pledged to change the law to help Musk out with those pesky Tesla protesters.
Some say they should be labeled domestic terrorists.
I will do that. I'll do it. I'm going to stop them. We catch anybody doing it because they're harming a great American company.
Grace, are you surprised that Donald Trump is Tesla's new spokesmodel?
Funnily enough, I'm not surprised. I actually released this book last year in which I argue that capitalism is not a free market system. There is no real separation between the public and private sectors. The idea that we have this competition between states and markets is a misreading of the way that capitalism works. And in fact, it's an oligarchic system based on deep cooperation between interests in the public and private sector. And I have lots of case studies from Boeing to ExxonMobil. Tesla is not one of them. And I think what's really funny about this is that usually the comic capitalist villains in any story do not head consumer-facing companies because consumers know who the CEOs are. And like, if you're going to be, you know, the CEO of Boeing at a time when it cuts corners and, you know, there are 2 separate plane crashes that killed nearly 350 people, you as a consumer don't really get to choose which planes you fly on. So it doesn't have too much of an impact in terms of consumer sentiment. Equally, if you're like a massive oil company and everyone knows you're evil, well, people still have to fill up their cars, right? You can choose which car you buy. And people, it's one of the goods that people choose to indicate something about their identity, right? Like people buy 4x4s because they want to seem strong and powerful and like, you know, they don't care about the climate. People used to buy Teslas because they wanted to seem like good people. They wanted to be like, I'm a nice ethical consumer who cares about the climate. He's literally completely destroyed his own customer base and his own USP, which is really funny. So in that sense, like, you know, I couldn't have predicted it. I also have an understanding as to why he's like turned so far to the right. I wrote a thread about this. I basically think it has to do with when he started having to confront his unions. That was like the root of Musk's rightward turn. And there's a really funny analogy there with Elon Musk, who hates unions and has ended up becoming a fascist, with Henry Ford, who also hated unions and sent thugs to beat up his workers when they went on strike, and was also mentioned positively by Hitler. And was given a medal, that only foreigners be given a medal by Hitler. So there seems to be this like thing of American automobile manufacturers who have very close relationships with the government, as both Ford and Musk did, who end up going to war with their unions and then relying on the state to basically crush worker power, and through that becoming quasi-fascists. So yeah, there's an interesting historical parallel for you.
Yeah, it's not really an historical parallel I wanted to hear. But we're going to call it there, Grace. Thank you so much for joining me and for, you know, explaining these complex economic phenomena so clearly to our audience. I'm sure it's greatly appreciated.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been great to be here.
And thanks everyone for tuning in. Do come back tomorrow for another live show at 6 p.m. Until then, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.